Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. I've got a pretty exciting video today. We're going to talk about the AYANEO Flip DS. Now, this is a clamshell device. As you can see, it's pretty darn thick, but it's got two screens, and this is pretty awesome. This is the first handheld PC that I've seen with a dual screen setup, and it actually opens up a whole world of possibilities. When the company first announced it, I thought it was going to be a gimmick. I thought, man, that's way too much money to be spending just to be able to play 3DS games. But the more I used it, the more I realized that this actually increases the use cases for this device significantly. And so I ended up spending almost a week just poking and prodding this device, finding all the different ways that it benefits from having two screens. And so that's one of the things that we'll cover here in this review. We'll talk about, of course, the controls and how it feels, but then also I want to talk about the myriad use cases that I found. And then we'll also wrap it up with a couple of the items that I thought need some improvement. And so we've got a lot of ground to cover. This is probably going to be a long video. Grab a snack and drink, and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, to start, let's go over the pricing and specs of the AYANEO Flip. And they're actually offering two different models. One is called the keyboard version, that obviously will have a keyboard installed. And then the one I'm reviewing here today is called the dual screen or DS model. And the pricing between the two is going to be the same. Let's take a look at that. Now to start, this is a handheld Windows PC, so it is fairly expensive. Think of it like a really small laptop. And the pricing starts at about $740, but goes all the way up to almost $1,500. And that's going to depend on the amount of RAM and storage that you want in your device. We also have two different chips to choose from. We have the 7840U, which we've seen in a bunch of handhelds over the past year, but they also have the new 8840U available as an option too. Now, this new chip generation is not a huge bump, but it's only a $40 difference between the two. So if I was to pick one, I would definitely go with the 8840U. Of note, the model they sent me for review is a 7840U, and it's got 32 gigabytes of RAM and 2 terabytes of storage. So the one I'm testing is going to be around the $1,000 price point. Now, obviously, this is a lot more expensive than something like a Steam Deck or even the ROG Ally. So let's take a look at what you get for that price. To start, we have a 7-inch 1080p display up top, and it runs at 120 Hz. However, bear in mind that we don't have a variable refresh rate on this screen like we do with the ROG Ally. Now, here are the specs for the bottom screen. It's 3.5 inches with a 3:2 aspect ratio and a resolution of 960 by 640. And the refresh rate on this one is 60 Hz. We've got quite a few options when it comes to connectivity. Number one, this has an Oculink port, which will give you PCI speeds if you wanted to hook it up to something like an external GPU. We also have two USB-C ports, but they're not the same speed. One is full speed USB 4, but the other one is USB 3.2 Gen 2. In addition, we've got a microSD card slot if you want to expand your storage, and it also comes with Wi-Fi 6E and Bluetooth 5.2. And then finally, the other aspect worth noting is the battery is relatively large. It's 45 watt hours. So that is about 10% larger than what you would find on the original Steam Deck as well as the ROG Ally. And of course, we'll do a bunch of battery testing near the end of this video. So let's go ahead and jump into the unboxing and my first impressions. Now, this is a review unit sent over to me from AYANEO, and it's also an early test unit, which means that there might be some things different between this one and the retail units. And as my standard disclaimer here, I'm not getting paid in any way for this review. All opinions are my own, and they're not seeing this ahead of time. Now, AYANEO usually does a great job when it comes to the packaging. Everything looks nice and clean. Inside, there's a quick start menu, both for the hardware itself as well as their ISpace 2.0 software. And below that, we have the device and a bunch of boxes. Let's start opening these up. In the first box, we've got a couple USB-C adapters, and then we also have the standard plug-in adapters that usually come with every AYANEO device. For example, this one right here is definitely for Antarctica. Let's look inside the other boxes. This one has some additional grips. We'll take a closer look at this later. And we've also got a standard USB-C charging cable as well as their power brick. Of note, the one that came with my device is a 65 watt total charge. So let's go ahead and start taking a look at the device itself. And first impression here, man, this is a heavy device. It definitely feels really chunky and solid. I wouldn't go as far as saying it's uncomfortably heavy, but it is a constant reminder that this thing is a full-on computer. Another thing I like to check with the darker AYANEO devices is whether or not the plastic is going to be fingerprinty. And unfortunately, this one is a lot like all of their others in the sense that they get really smudgy very quickly. In fact, funny story, the company knows that I hate their black models, and they even emailed me to apologize when they said, "I'm sorry, we only have black models, we can't send you a white one." Anyway, if smudging bothers you like it does for me, then yeah, I would say steer clear of the black one and maybe go for the white version. And here's a look at it after about 3 or 4 days of use. This is even after wiping it down from time to time. So the black model is definitely smudgy, and I was kind of expecting that knowing that I was getting this color. Now on the top of the screen here, we have this little indented circle. Initially I thought this was going to be RGB lighting, and that would be pretty cool, but it's not. It's just going to be a solid circle. So let's take a look at the outside I/O, starting with the top. On the left side, we have our shoulders and triggers, and then also an additional function button. And this one can be programmed within the IO-Space settings, and there's all sorts of functions you can assign for it. Further down, we have a micro SD card slot that opens up with a little flap. And then we have an onboard microphone input, an LED indicator for charging, and then our two USB-C ports. The one on the left is going to be the USB 4 port. And then finally to the right of that we have our Oculink port, and then below all of that is going to be our exhaust vent. And I do have an external GPU that I can test with Oculink. We'll do that near the end of the video. Now let's take a look at the bottom. We'll start with these two stereo speakers and a quick audio test. Now, AYANEO told me not to test the audio because they said they're still optimizing it, but all the same, I found that it was quite loud and pretty crisp. And so I don't really have a lot of complaints about the audio here on this device compared to others that they've released before. And if they are able to optimize the quality of the audio, it might get even better from here. Either way, at least for me, even with this test unit, I think it's good enough. Other than that, on the bottom, we have another microphone input and then our headphone jack. Now let's open it up and take a look at the I/O and buttons that we have inside. And I'd say the function buttons up top here are fairly unique. On the left, we have our volume up and down, which for some reason is at a 45-degree angle. Next, we have an Xbox menu button and then a bottom Windows button. When you press on this, it's going to toggle between the IO-Space metrics and then just a regular Windows screen. On the right side, we have our power button, which also acts as a fingerprint sensor. And then we have an IR mouse function, which will come in handy if you need more granular controls than what you can do on the touchscreen. So let's now jump into the controls and overall ergonomics of the device. We're going to start with the analog sticks. Now these are Nintendo Switch style Joy-Con sticks, so they're about the same size, but they do use a Hall sensor magnetic connection. And AYANEO has been using these same sticks for a couple years now. We find them in their AYANEO Air products and also their new AYANEO Slide. Now the sticks themselves are quite recessed, and that's because they need to be able to clear the screen when actually closing the device. And this is very similar to other clamshell devices like the GPD Win Mini and the GPD Win Max 2. Now I don't have the Win Mini on me, I actually sent it back to GPD to get a new plastic shell for it, but as far as I remember, this feels exactly the same. And in the end, I feel like these sticks are serviceable, but not something that I really enjoy. After all, it is quite a compromise to push down these sticks so low. And when playing a dual analog style game like a first-person shooter, I found that the range of motion feels fairly limited. I like to describe this as being a very flicky kind of feeling. So it's definitely not going to compare to a full-on console controller or even a Nintendo Switch, which doesn't have those recessed sticks. If anything, I wish that they had gone with a different design. For example, if they had detachable sticks like on the Xbox Elite controller. That way you could stow them somewhere on the device when you're closing it down, but then when you open it up, you'll have a lot more space, so you could then pop them on and have a full range of motion. Either way, having a clamshell is going to have some compromises when it comes to controls, and this is one of them. Next, let's move over to the D-pad. This is a brand new design I haven't seen before from AYANEO. Now the D-pad here is almost completely flush with the rest of the shell, and it uses a micro switch connection which is relatively soft to press down on. However, the travel here is basically non-existent. There is no pivot, and it's essentially just a matter of pushing down on each of those directions. If anything, it reminds me more of pressing down on a mouse button than it does an actual gaming button. Now that being said, it does feel fairly accurate, and so let's do some real-world testing and see how it actually falls out when playing a game. We'll start with the contra test. Here I'm going to press down on the D-pad and then rock it left and right. And because we basically have zero travel here, there is no ability to rock this D-pad at all. Instead, you can really kind of push it to the point where it does hit a diagonal, but it does take a lot of force, so I don't think that you would accidentally press a diagonal when using this D-pad at all. And for a game like Contra, when you want to make sure you're hitting a precise control, I think that's going to be a pretty good fit. But it does feel a little bit strange to use a D-pad like this that has basically no travel at all. Now the other side of the spectrum is to test it with a Capcom fighting game like Street Fighter 3 Third Strike. And for this one, it's also a little bit weird. I can definitely pull off a Hadouken and Shoryuken, but it requires very precise input. And because the D-pad is somewhat clicky, you will know exactly whether or not you're hitting the right button at the right time. And so it's almost like you're getting direct feedback when something is off with your controls. And so I think as you acclimate to that overall feeling, it might end up being a very accurate D-pad for fighting games. But like I mentioned, pressing a D-pad like this does feel a little bit odd. It wasn't to the point where I thought it was bad, it was just something that was just a little bit unusual. So even though it is passing all of my D-pad tests, it's not something I would consider to be a good or a bad D-pad. It's somewhere in between and also a little bit strange. Below the D-pad on the left side, we have our select and start buttons, and now let's move over to the right side. We'll start with the face buttons. Now these have a very similar quality to the D-pad, so they are a micro switch connection and have very, very shallow travel. And much like with the D-pad, it feels like you're pressing down on a mouse button. I would say they give you maybe a little bit more resistance than a mouse button, but not by much. Again, I wouldn't call these buttons bad, but on a device that's primarily made for gaming, it does feel a little bit unconventional. And much like with the D-pad, these do give you a clicky feedback. So let's do a quick audio test so you can hear what they're going to sound like. In the end, I'm kind of torn about these controls. I think they're serviceable. There was no time where I thought, man, these are bad controls and they're inhibiting my gameplay. But all the same, it kind of feels like they're made by a company that's never made a gamepad before. And that's doubly strange coming from a company like AYANEO, who seems to put out a new gaming device every month or so. And then finally, below the right analog stick, we have two other buttons. These are going to be your AYA space button on the left, and the other one is programmable, but by default, it is set to show your desktop. Now let's try out these shoulders and triggers. These shoulder buttons are easy to press down on, they have a soft click to them. In fact, I like pressing these buttons more than the face buttons. Either way, no complaints about these shoulder buttons. Let's move on to the triggers. Now these triggers also use a magnetic hall sensor much like the analog sticks, and I think they work out pretty well. The travel on them is somewhat shallow, and the triggers themselves are relatively small, but given the fact this is a clamshell device, I wouldn't want them to be super large. One interesting note is that when pressing down on them, they kind of go inwards at an angle. Usually most triggers will go straight down when you press on them, but these are a little bit different in that they kind of go inwards. It takes a little bit of time to get used to because it kind of feels like you're squeezing towards the center, but after a few minutes I got totally used to it. So no complaints about the triggers either. I think the travel and resistance is just about perfect. Now another concern with clamshells is whether or not you can still press on these shoulder buttons when you have the screen fully extended. And I'm happy to report that it's actually fairly easy to do so. Now you're not going to be able to reach around and press the button fully, but it's super easy to press the bumpers from the sides themselves, and so you don't really have to curl your fingers around to reach them. Instead, you can kind of focus on the triggers and then use the other side of your index finger to bump the bumpers, and you'll be good to go. Now when it comes to overall ergonomics, there are a couple notes. Number one is the fact that this kind of angles out at a 90-degree angle at the front. And when holding the device, it is something that feels just a little bit sharp to the palm of my hand. And so it does leave me with a flat kind of feeling here at the front. And this is the same story with like the GPD Win Mini or even the Lenovo Legion Go controllers. And we'll talk about that more in a second, but let's first talk about the grips on the back. Now these bump out a little bit, which is great, and by default they have a bit of a gritty texture. But if you remember from the unboxing, it does come with a different type of grip style. This one seems a little bit more linear and smoother, and I'm not really sure I'd prefer that. I like the kind of grippy feel. But it's nice to have an option to change them out, and it looks like these just snap into place. There's no screws or anything. Either way, I'm just going to stick with the default ones because I think these better suit my needs. Now let's take a look at the bumps on the back, and as you can see, they have a nice kind of rounded ergonomic grip to them. And I like this for two reasons. Number one, it's not super big and prominent, which means that it's still going to be relatively pocketable, but the fact that we also even have it in the first place does make it a more comfortable grip. In general, I would just expect that you're going to be spreading your fingers out across the back, but that little bit of ergonomic bump does make it quite a bit more comfortable than something that's more flat like the GPD Win Mini. And so I think it's great that AYANEO did at least make these grips because it does make it more comfortable. But it is a shame that the front has such a sharp 90-degree angle. Now I understand that they are probably limited in the fact that they are trying to close the clamshell so it can't be super rounded. And so if anything, I would say it's just a compromise that's inherent in using a clamshell like this. One other thing worth mentioning when it comes to the overall control experience is that this device does get relatively warm. Basically, anytime you get above about 15 watts of TDP, you can definitely feel that it's getting warmer, and there are definitely parts that get hot, including the bottom screen and then that space between the D-pad and that bottom screen too. Thankfully, you never really touch those parts when playing the device, so it doesn't get hot, but all the same, you can definitely feel that it's getting warm. And I think the overall heat of this device does contribute to the smudginess of the plastic as well, because it does make my hands pretty warm. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the hinge. Now, the company has said that they're still working on it, so this isn't the final design, but I did at least want to show how it works from a functional standpoint. When you open it up, it actually clicks into 3 different places, much like the 3DS. You have one that's a little bit more than 90 degrees, then you have one that's closer to about 140 or so, and then a full 180. And I think those 3 are excellent positions for the hinge, much like how they are on the 3DS. Now, I'm not an expert when it comes to hinge mechanisms, but I can tell you that it feels very tight and secure. However, it does feel like something that I probably wouldn't want to give to a kid to use and abuse. Now, that being said, I feel like this is a handheld that's more made for adults than children anyway, and so in general, I do think this is going to be babied more than, say, for example, your standard Nintendo 3DS. Either way, in my week of testing, I never had any issues with the hinge, and it felt super secure and not wobbly at all. And I think if they're going to be improving the design when it goes to retail, that can only be a good thing. Next, I want to talk about size and weight comparisons against other similar devices. To start, I want to compare it against other handheld PCs that are of a similar price point as well as performance level. And so here it is in comparison to the ROG Ally, as well as the Steam Deck OLED, and then the Lenovo Legion Go. And when closed down, it is quite a bit smaller than all 3 of these. I would say it's about in the middle range of the AYANEO devices. For example, it's much smaller than their AYANEO Kun, but it is bigger than the AYANEO Air 2S. Now, a lot of people have been comparing this to the 3DS and the Wii U for obvious reasons, so let's do a size comparison with those. Here's my regular new Nintendo 3DS, and then I also have a new 2DS XL. And as you can see, the AYANEO Flip is quite a bit larger. And then finally, here's how it compares against the Wii U tablet controller. Now, even though the AYANEO Flip does look relatively small, it is especially thick and heavy. Here it is in comparison to the AYANEO Air 2S, and you can see, yeah, it is quite a bit thicker. When measuring it at its thickest point, it's about 36.5 millimeters, or a little bit under 1.5 inches. And it's also quite heavy, 652 grams, which makes it heavier than something like the ROG Ally, and over twice the weight of a Nintendo 3DS. Now, personally, I don't mind that it's big and chunky. In fact, it just feels really impressive to pick up and hold. Yeah, it's a little bit heavy, but it's also a nice reminder that this is a full-blown Windows PC. But if you're looking for something that's easily pocketable, I think this is a little bit outside of that scope. Now, if you have like cargo shorts or maybe some Janko jeans, it'll probably be fine, but for most other use cases, you can probably cram it into one of your pockets, but you're not going to want to walk around like that. So in the end, I would say this kind of falls into the portable but not pocketable category. But of course, there's all sorts of benefits for the clamshell device and the fact that it doesn't really need a case. You can just throw it into a bag and it's going to be pretty well protected. And so from a pick up and go kind of handheld PC or small laptop perspective, yeah, it's going to work fine. Next, I want to briefly talk about the software experience of the AYANEO Flip, and I'm mostly going to focus on the things that are unique to this device. To start, on the bottom, by default, we'll have a whole suite of metrics and controls. Here you can do things like adjust your TDP on the fly. Personally, I've just been using it on the Smart TDP function, but you can manually adjust it if you would like as well. And most of these metrics are going to be self-explanatory, although I do wish they had an FPS counter, which is for some reason not here. I've also noticed a couple software bugs as they're developing it. For example, the battery readout was not accurate. Now to the right of that, we have what they call the Quick Assistant, and that's going to have just a bunch of different quick menu options. And this will be things like turning on airplane mode or disconnecting your controller, or maybe just tapping on an escape or Windows button if you need it. The one I use the most is the ability to turn off the screen. So if I'm trying to save a little bit of battery life, I'll do that. And to bring that back up, you would press the iSpace button and then go into their Quick Assistant section and then turn it back on. And finally, to the right of that, we have an Applications tab. So here you can assign whatever apps you want. And these are just going to work like quick shortcuts to open up any sort of app that you would like. So for example, I can tap on the Plex button. That's going to open up my Plex app, which will then connect to my home server, and then I can watch movies directly from there. And that's really about it when it comes to software, but one other thing worth mentioning in this section is the screen brightness. Now overall, I would say this is a relatively bright screen, but I did find that the dynamic range between the most bright and dim is actually not that much. So for the most part, I usually would play this at around 40% brightness when playing a game. One other thing of note, and this is probably a software related bug, but adjusting the brightness will only adjust the top screen. I found no way to adjust the bottom screen brightness at all. Even when trying to adjust it directly through the Windows interface, I had no luck. So hopefully this is one of the many things that they'll iron out before the retail release. Now next I want to move into the potential use cases that kind of open up using a two-screen device. And by far this is the section of the video where I spent the most time getting everything set up. And even then, I probably didn't hit every single use case that might pertain to you. Either way, I think you have a lot of different options. You have your standard one where you can just play a game up top and then have your metrics down below. And this will be great if you want to monitor those metrics, although like I mentioned, I wish it had frames per second down here too. And of course, you don't have to use these metrics at all. You can put whatever you want on that bottom screen. I would think of this kind of like a Windows machine that's hooked up to two different monitors. So on one monitor, you could put a music player, so you could play music while playing your favorite retro game and have a really nice kind of relaxing experience. Or say you're playing one of those old role-playing games like Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door. You could pull up the Game FAQ's website and actually scroll through the text to find where you are and then kind of help with a walkthrough of the game itself. Or if you want to play multiplayer, you could have a Discord app down below, so you could chat with your friends while playing something, either a PC game or even a retro game. And of course, you could play movies or TV shows down below as well. Now, it's not a super high resolution screen, it's only a 640p resolution, but even then, it's been nice to have just a little distraction while I'm playing a classic game. Of course, if you wanted to go the opposite route, you could put the video up top and then play the game down below. And it just so happens that with a 3:2 aspect ratio and a 640p resolution, that's a perfect 4x integer scale of Game Boy Advance. So this might be a great pairing for you if you want to binge watch maybe one of your old favorite TV shows while also going through an old role-playing game. This might be a good match. Now, one thing I found in my week of testing is that in order to fully unlock the experience, I had to use a lot of third-party apps to really tweak it where I needed it. So let me show you a couple different options that myself and members of the community found just in these early days of testing. The first one's an app called Tablet Pro Studio, and this is originally made for Windows Surface tablets but can definitely be used here as well. One of the functions that works well is the ability to turn an entire screen into a touchpad. So if we assign that to the bottom screen, we now have a fully functioning touchpad on the bottom. And I found that this gives me more accurate and granular controls compared to that IR mouse that we have on the top right. Now it does get pretty hot like I mentioned before, but I have found this to be my preferred way when it comes to navigating windows. You can even use it for a 2-finger tap function for a right click. Now another thing that a lot of people ask me about is whether or not you can turn the bottom screen into a keyboard. And unfortunately, if you're just using the Windows keyboard, you cannot, and that's because it prioritizes the top screen. However, there is an app called On-Screen Keyboard Pro from Comfort Software, and this actually allows you to assign which screen to put the keyboard. The keyboard itself is a little bit cramped just because the screen is only 3.5 inches, but if you do want to have a quick toggle for a keyboard function, you can definitely do that too. And it's especially nice considering the fact that it doesn't cover over your top screen. So let me give you a quick setup scenario. I'm going to use a mouse just to make it a little bit more simple to follow. So here I have my Citra 3DS emulator running with a dual screen setup, and now I want to push my secondary screen down to the bottom. To do that, we're going to press on that IA space button on the right. That's going to toggle off the metrics control so that we have just a standard window. And now I can move down my secondary window to go into that screen. However, once I maximize it, you can see there's still a top Windows bar, and that can be pretty distracting when you're trying to play a game. And surprise, surprise, we have to use a third-party app to get rid of that border as well. This app is called Borderless Gaming, and it's a very simple setup. From here, all I have to do is just turn on the app and then bring up the menu, and then find the window that you want to expand and remove the border from. So I'm going to click on that, and then I'm going to press this expand button, and that will maximize it and then also take away that top bar. From there, I can go into the Citra menu and then turn on full screen, which will only affect that top screen. And now we're good to go. I've got both of these at full screen, taking up as much space as they can. Now, in addition to your standard 2-screen gaming for things like Nintendo 3DS and Wii U, there are other games that will benefit from having this 2-screen function. For example, there were a lot of Nintendo GameCube games that supported plugging in with a link cable specifically for the Game Boy Advance. Now, most of these games used this kind of functionality in a multiplayer capacity. So for example, here I'm playing Legend of Zelda 4 Swords Adventure, both on the GameCube, and then on the screen below I'm playing the Game Boy Advance version. And with this setup it does unlock some functions, but like I mentioned, it's more multiplayer minded. So unless you have somebody else with an external controller who wants to join in on the fun, this may not be a great example. However, there are also plenty of other single player games that would unlock special features if you did plug in a Game Boy Advance. Probably the most apparent example is going to be Animal Crossing. When you plug in Game Boy Advance and you go down to the bottom of the town, there's going to be a boat waiting for you at the dock. And this boat is going to take you to a special island that's only unlockable if you have a Game Boy Advance hooked up. Now, I don't know enough about Animal Crossing to know really what this is going to unlock, but all the same, it's pretty cool to access a new area of this game by virtue of using a two-screen setup like this. So it's a little neat functionality that's available on an AYANEO Flip that isn't quite as easy to access on other devices. Another app that's really handy with a two-screen setup is called On-Top Replica. And the setup for this is relatively simple. What it essentially will do is take any space of your primary screen and then allow you to trim that and then put it on a different screen. And I think this will work really well in many different contexts. We'll start with PC games, especially those that are open world and have a minimap. Using this app, we can go and we can select the minimap area, and then we can zoom into exactly the space that we want and then duplicate it on that second screen. Now we can move that second screen onto the bottom screen, and now we have a larger mini map that we can consult if we would like. And as you can imagine, this can be used in a variety of different use cases depending on the game that you're playing. Here's another neat example. I'm going to use the standalone Dreamcast emulator called Demule. This one actually has a separate VMU window for the games that support it. The problem is that window is super small and there's no way to resize it, but if we use On-Top Replica, we can then replicate that window and then make it as big as we'd like. And so this is kind of awesome as well. If you play these old Dreamcast games and you have that VMU hooked up on your controller, you can replicate that experience here on the AYANEO Flip. Another example that works pretty well is with Nintendo DS. Unfortunately, there is no app that allows these to have two separate windows. The closest I found is using the Melon DS standalone emulator. This one will at least allow you to resize the window and prioritize the size between the top and the bottom. And so this is only one window, but it's stretching between both the top and the bottom screens. And I'd say this is a pretty close approximation to the Nintendo DS experience, although you do have that top menu window that you can't really get rid of. But again, that On-Top Replica app comes to save the day. Here I can make two different windows that are being replicated, and then I can resize them however I would like. And so here I have the Melon DS app working in the background, and then I have these two screens above it, and then I've resized them to fit exactly where I would like them. It's a bit of a workaround to get this all set up, but once you have it running, it's pretty awesome. And finally, one other use case that really complements the whole gameplay experience is if you use the handheld companion app. This app will allow you to trick the AYANEO into thinking it has PlayStation 4 controls. And by virtue of having the DualShock 4 connected to your AYANEO, that means that you will then be able to use motion controls for the apps that support it. And so you'll be able to use this in certain emulators, like for the 3DS, Wii U, and Nintendo Switch. And I think that's really going to enhance the gameplay experience in some of those games that really rely on those tilt controls. Okay, next I want to move into game testing, and we're going to talk about some examples as we go through here as well, because there are a couple more use cases. We're going to start with Nintendo DS, and like I mentioned, the standalone Melon DS seems to give me the best experience, but you will either have to use that third-party app that I mentioned before, or stretch this screen across the two windows. Either way, playing Nintendo DS games like this is pretty awesome, especially for games like Sonic Rush that used both screens vertically. The mismatched screen size does take a little bit of time to get used to, but after that, it is a pretty great experience. And you can actually improve the experience in certain games. For example, with Tecmo Bowl Kickoff, this one actually had all the action on the bottom screen. And given that the bottom screen is smaller than the top one, we can actually just go into the Melon DS settings, and then we can swap the screens so that the top one is on the bottom and vice versa. And now we have all the action up top in the much bigger screen, and it looks a lot better. One thing of note, the touch screen on this is not going to be the same as it was on a 3DS or regular DS. And so you won't be able to use a stylus on these like you did back in the day. Now you could always use your finger as the touchpad, or I think if you have one of those active pens like for a Windows Surface tablet, that should probably work here as well. Either way, it's not a one-for-one experience with the Nintendo DS, but it is pretty close with a little bit of tweaking. Next, we'll move over to Nintendo 3DS, and I want to talk about screen quality and size. And I think there's a big difference between the original 3DS and this one. To start, the top screen is just massive compared to the other, but then also the quality is a lot better, and because this device is so powerful, we can play this at like a 4x upscale and it's still going to run great. Now, one thing worth noting is that the bottom screen on the AYANEO Flip is actually smaller than the bottom screen on an XL version of the 3DS. So it does make things a little bit smaller to read, but even then I never really had any problem playing any game and still reading the text down below. And for a lot of 3DS games, the bottom screen was used like as a menu function, and so as a result, it's a pretty good match anyway. And from a comparison standpoint, you can see that the screen on the AYANEO Flip is a lot more rich and vibrant than the original Nintendo hardware. Either way, when it comes to playing 3DS games, I found this to be a very good experience. The Citra emulator does have that dual screen setup, so it's pretty easy to get everything up and running. But then also playing these games at a 4x resolution with that big screen up top is a really great experience too. Now, given the fact that this device is like $750 plus, I definitely wouldn't buy it only for 3DS, but it also doesn't take away from the fact that this is one of the best ways to play 3DS bar none. Another system that is greatly enhanced with the AYANEO Flip is going to be Nintendo Wii U. This emulator also has the ability to have a separate gamepad, and so you can put that screen down below. And this is going to replicate whatever showed up on the Wii U tablet when you were playing the original console. And for many games, it's going to be a mini-map function. That means it's not really going to take away from the overall experience by not seeing the screen, but I think that with certain games, being able to see the screen actually makes it a little bit more of an enhanced experience compared to playing it on anything else. When playing Hyrule Warriors, you can see a list of tasks down below, or when playing Mario Tennis, you can glance down and see the score even if it's not being shown on the top screen. I also found this to be a really nice complement to indie games, something like Guacamelee or Shovel Knight. These games have a minimap or a menu down below, and that's really kind of neat because you don't find that on anything else. So even though you can just play the PC ports of these games relatively easily, it's kind of neat to have both screens showing like this instead. For other games, the experience can be greatly enhanced by having that second screen. For example, I love playing Wind Waker HD on various different handhelds and computers, but it's always a pain when you have to see that second screen in order to save your game. Typically, you have to press the tab button on your keyboard in order to pull that up, but on the AYANEO Flip, you don't have to do anything. You can just tap on that save button and you're good to go. Twilight Princess has a similar setup, but also a map function, so that's going to be really nice too. And of course, from a performance standpoint, these games can play at 1080p, absolutely no problem. They're only pulling about 11 watts altogether. Another interesting thing I found is that some games that many people didn't really enjoy because of the Wii tablet function are actually better on the AYANEO Flip. For example, Star Fox Zero has two different views. On the tablet function, you have the cockpit view, and then up top you have your full screen. Now, Star Fox Zero kind of gets a bad rep, and I think part of that has to do with the fact that there are parts in the game that require you to look down at the tablet, while still trying to keep an eye of what's going on your TV up above. Now with the AYANEO Flip experience, we have both of these windows very close to one another, so you can just glance between the two very easily. And so I think this actually might be an improved experience over the original Wii U console. Another game that benefits from this setup is Paper Mario Color Splash. This game required you to look down at the tablet during battle so that you could swipe a card in order to hit your enemy. And that can be pretty distracting while trying to play it on the tablet or even trying to emulate it on a different console. But here it actually feels very natural, so this is a great experience. Now, playing Wii U games on this dual screen setup is not going to be enhanced with every game. In fact, there are many games that just duplicate the bottom screen down below. And so if anything, these games are just going to waste extra battery life. So in this kind of scenario, I would just close down that second screen and use the metrics or turn the screen off altogether. Either way, it does go to show that not every single Wii U game is going to benefit from the two-screen setup like it does on the 3DS. Next, I want to talk a little bit about retro gaming because there is something worth noting here in RetroArch. Because we have a 120Hz screen, that means we can use black frame insertion. You can find this within the video synchronization settings, and I'd recommend turning this setting on to 1. This means that when playing 60Hz content like most retro games, every other screen is going to be a black frame. And this goes a long way to making a smoother experience when you're playing those games. I did a whole section about black frame insertion in my latest ROG Ally review video from a couple months back, but as a quick example, this can greatly reduce motion blur when playing these games. On the left, it's running at 60Hz, and on the right, we have black frame insertion. You'll see on the left that Donkey Kong can get pretty blurry from time to time, whereas on the right, everything will stay nice and crisp. And so I found that's probably the main benefit of having a 120Hz display here on the AYANEO Flip. It's going to make a lot of these retro games look especially good, and so I recommend using black frame insertion if you are going to use RetroArch. And because this device is so powerful, you can really push it. For example, here I'm playing Sega Saturn with the Beetle core, and this is a very accurate core, so it's going to feel a lot like playing Sega Saturn. But on top of that, we have BFI turned on, so it's going to feel like you're playing on a CRT television. And to top it off, we're going to use a CRT Royale shader to enhance that experience even more. So here we are playing on a handheld PC, giving us a very similar to CRT experience with our retro games. Now I've tested the 7840U in many different contexts, so I'm not going to do a full suite of game testing, but I did want to show that many of these other systems are going to run just fine. So this chip is not going to have any problem when it comes to emulating PlayStation 2 games, and the same thing with most PlayStation 3 games as well. You might get a bottleneck with those harder to run games just by virtue of the fact that this only goes up to a 28 watt TDP, but I would say that the majority of PS3 games are going to be just fine. And it'll be a similar story with emulating other systems, including Xbox 360. Many games will run well, but you'll still get a bottleneck at that 28 watt TDP, and so some games will have some slowdown from time to time. And that'll be a similar story with Nintendo Switch emulation using the Yuzu emulator. This will play most Switch titles, but you will be limited at that 28 watt TDP for some games. Now when it comes to PC gaming, this will play most games, but with some limitations. For example, if you wanted to play with the full 120 Hz, you're not going to be able to play many games. Just really the lightweight games are going to cap out there. For example, Horizon Chase Turbo, which is a very lightweight game, requires up to 18 watts to run at 120 Hz. So as you can imagine, as you start increasing the level of difficulty to play a game, it's going to cap out. And so for most games, especially those that are of the AAA variety, you're probably going to have the same setbacks that you will with other handhelds that have a 60 Hz display. You're going to have to play things on low settings or reduce the resolution down to 720p, and even then it'll be pretty rare to get over 60 frames per second. Now one question I saw a lot was whether or not I found a performance difference between having one screen on or two. And in general, I found the performance difference to be somewhat negligible. It's usually about a 1 or 2 watt difference with having that second screen on. And that's really only going to come into play when you're pushing it to the max 28 watt TDP. For everything else, it just means that the total package power is going to be 1 or 2 watts higher. So in terms of having a performance setback by having those two screens running, I didn't really see it unless I was really pushing the system all the way up to 28 watts. Speaking of pushing the system, let's do a quick audio test of the fan. I'm already running this at a high TDP, but I'm also going to max out the fan so you can hear what it's going to be like in a worst case scenario. And overall, I would say it's not bad. It gets about as loud as the original Steam Deck when at max speed. And then finally in my testing, I wanted to hook up my Oculink cable to test how this is going to work with an external GPU. So here I have it plugged in with both Oculink and then my USB 4 port, and these are both going into the GPD-G1. And I made a video about this external GPU before, I'll leave it linked down below. And this GPU can also function as a dock, so I have my keyboard, mouse, and controller all hooked up to this as well. And so this is a pretty Gucci dock setup right here. Now from a software standpoint, I did run into a couple issues. For example, Windows could not differentiate between the bottom screen on the AYANEO Flip and the monitor that I was plugged into. And so no matter what I tried to do within the Windows display settings, I couldn't actually get it to turn off both screens on the device and only show on the monitor. Instead, it would have to show on the bottom screen, and that did come with some limitations. For example, when playing games, I was being bottlenecked by that screen down below. Not only was the graphics data having to pass between the device and through the screen and then back out to the monitor, but because they were being treated like the same screen, I was also being capped by the frames per second on the bottom screen. And so even though this monitor caps out at 144 frames per second, it was being limited to 60 frames per second because of that bottom screen. And I'm not sure if AYANEO caught this when they were actually setting this all up, but I will report this to them to see if they can fix it in the software. And so if you were specifically looking to use this with an external monitor setup, I would wait until we have a software update before pulling that trigger. Alright, and before we get into the summary, let's go into our battery testing. And I did quite a few tests here, so let me walk you through the entire experience. We're going to start at the far right with Celeste. This is going to be our best case scenario. In order to get this game to run at 60 frames per second, I had to set the TDP to 6 watts, and then I tested it both with only the top screen running and then also with both screens running. And I found there was only about a 7-minute difference between the two. But the thing worth noting is that the overall max time was not that great. I got less than 2.5 hours by playing a very lightweight game. So when it comes to having a long battery life, even when playing lightweight games, I'm not really seeing it here with the AYANEO Flip. Moving along, we're going to do two things at once. We're going to play a Game Boy Advance game up top and then also run a movie using Plex on the bottom. And in this setup, it took about 8 watts to get running and gave me 2 hours and 8 minutes of battery life. Now, if I flip that around and put Plex up top to run a movie and then Game Boy Advance on the bottom, it actually required more power. So this required 9 watts to get running, and it did take a little bit more juice, about 2 hours even. Next up, we're going to move over to Nintendo Wii U using both screens on with Legend of Zelda Wind Waker HD. This one requires 11 watt TDP, which is about right when it comes to emulating this console, and I got just under 2 hours of battery life altogether. From there, we'll move into Hades at 15 watts, 1080p default settings. In this one, I did try to push the frame rate as much as possible. I got an average frame rate of 105 frames per second, and that gave me about an hour and a half of battery life altogether. Moving on from there, we're going to play Doom Eternal at 1080p in medium settings and at 18 watt TDP. And for this, I set to a frame rate cap of 60 frames per second and got 1 hour and 22 minutes altogether. And finally, we'll do our worst case scenario. It doesn't really matter which game we use as long as we're pushing the TDP to 28 watts. And here I'm running Spider-Man at 1080p with very low settings, and I got an average frame rate of 35 frames per second and battery life just under an hour. So all told, we have between an hour and 2.5 hours of playtime depending on what you're playing. And as far as handheld PCs go, this is a little bit on the bad side. I've definitely seen better, but usually it comes from a device that has a bigger battery. And we also have to account for the fact that I had 2 screens running in all of this except for that one time with Celeste. Okay, with all that testing out of the way, it is time to move on and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the AYANEO Flip DS. As always, we're going to start with what I like, and number one, easily, is going to be the fact that we have 2 screens. And I love the fact that it expands to have so many different use cases beyond even just what I tested here in this video. Not only is it one of the best Wii U and 3DS experiences I've ever had, but it's really fun playing mixed media. For example, playing a lightweight role-playing game while also streaming a movie or TV show. I also really like that 7-inch screen up top. It is nice and vibrant, and it does get very bright. And by virtue of the fact that it's 120 Hz, we can use it with black frame insertion with certain games. And that's going to work especially good when it comes to those that originally played on CRT televisions. I also like the overall rounded shape of the device. It's not super comfortable, but all the same, I think that those back bumpers really do help. And I think when you put all those positives together, it's one of the most genuinely exciting handheld PCs that I've ever tested. I really love the fact that AYANEO tried to do something different here. It's not perfect, but all the same, it's a really great step in the right direction. But of course, it's not perfect, so let's talk about some of the things I didn't like about it. Number one, I found the controls just to be kind of middle of the road. Yes, they're functional, but I didn't really find them to be enjoyable, if that makes any sense. I also found that getting the most out of those 2 screens is a very complex setup. You're going to have to try a bunch of different third-party apps to get these to work the way you want them to, and I'm not really sure that the AYANEO software is ever really going to catch up. Either way, if you're looking for something you can just kind of pick up and play, this isn't really it. You're going to spend a lot of time in Windows with this handheld. Another thing that was a negative is that even though the screen is 120 Hz, it doesn't have variable refresh rate. And that's one of the best benefits of the ROG Ally because it gives you a very smooth experience, and you're not going to find that here. Next, I found the device to get pretty darn warm when using it. It's not to the point of getting hot or uncomfortable, but it did make my hands a little bit more sweaty than usual, and by virtue of that, it made the device more smudgy. Not only is the plastic just naturally smudgy, but when it gets warm, it's even worse. I also found the battery life to be a little bit disappointing. I think some of that has to do with the 2 screens, but then in general, I also found that the Flip DS just pulls a lot of power from this device. And this was a similar experience to the AYANEO Slide, where it's pulling more wattage than I was expecting. I'm not sure if this is something to do with the new version of IOSpace and it's just pulling more power, but I would not call this a very battery efficient device at all. All told, when you put all the negatives together, it does feel somewhat early adoptery. By that, I mean it feels like a first-generation product. Yes, I think that people who are willing to jump into it knowing what they're going to be getting are going to have a great time, but I'm not quite sure it's ready for a whole mainstream audience just yet. The best example is going to be the fact that you will have to spend a lot of time in Windows getting this all set up. And if that doesn't sound like a good time for you, then you may want to steer clear of the AYANEO Flip DS. However, if you're like me and you don't mind getting into the settings just to see what it can do, it can be a really thrilling and satisfying experience. In fact, I delayed the release of this video by a couple days just because I wanted to spend more time testing it, and that's not something that generally happens with a handheld PC. If anything, I would say the AYANEO Flip is one of those rare handhelds that I actually plan on using after I make the review. Generally, I just fall back to my staples, like the Odin 2 and the Steam Deck and the ROG Ally, but I think this one is going to get just as much screen time from me in the coming months. So really, that's about it for this video. Let me know what you think of the AYANEO Flip DS in the comments down below. In particular, what use case was the most exciting to you and the one that you think you would use the most. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.